Well, very interestingly, Prabodh has titled his talk today, Imaging the Text, Texting the Image. Face to face with Rabindranath Tagore's paintings. Prabodh Parikh is the director of the Katha Center of Film Studies. In fact, a man who wears many hats, not caps. And truly, because he involves himself with various aspects of the creative endeavor, from the philosophical to the visual to the poetic as well as. And he's a Gujarati poet of distinction, short fiction writer, and also an artist, and more importantly, a friend, and a very, very dear friend of many of the artists, very important artists. Parikh holds a master's degree in philosophy and humanities at the Oklahoma State University.
Namaste. It's quite a privilege because one is actually in presence of Tagore's paintings. This is the very first time that one is taking up the responsibility of being a witness. The word for being in presence of the work of artists, taking clue from Indian philosophical terms, is aparokshanubhuti. It's a very, and there is a word for it which is sanmukhta. So I'm playing with these two ideas. This aparokshanubhuti, which is to do with, unmediated encounter. And the second is, of course, sanmukhta, which is a close proximity. The notion of close proximity is also a very challenging notion because it makes you face to face, amne samne. And you have to also learn to look into the eye of the other, which is not easy. We are very good in not having an eye contact. So these two are very challenging ideas. The possibility of an unmediated vision, aparokshanubhuti, and the idea of being face to face in close proximity. Now, of course, one can do this imaginatively. One doesn't have to be actually doing this, by being in Delhi. Thanks to Rajiv and thanks to Shiv Kumar's extraordinary efforts, which has brought, Tagore's paintings to the world in such a manner that a very brilliant young Indian artist, Atul Doria, when he got these 4 books for the first time, and he almost danced over the telephone and said, Prabodh, this is going to change the history of the way we will look at Indian history of paintings. Okay, so we have these remarkable things happening. The young artists of India are looking at Tagore's work for the very first time. My take is it's a composition, I've composed this. I'm almost going to perform this, so to say. That's the only way I engage with Tagore. And I have a suggestion that's one of the most significant, rewarding and useful way of engaging with Tagore. I'm playing with a couple of ideas here. I might use the word khyal. When I say khyal, I mean they are not very well defined conceptual frameworks. I'm quite gently trained in creating conceptual frameworks, but I'm going to suspend that and play with the idea of an improvisation. Now all this is being done simply so one could go back to Tagore's paintings. Of course, I'm carrying my visiting card, you can get back to me also. So it's not only about looking at Tagore's paintings, about us looking at Tagore's paintings. That is to say, how do you know the dancer from the dance? We're looking at Tagore's paintings. We are equally looking at Tagore, but primarily we are looking at ourselves, looking at Tagore's paintings. So that's my third perspective. I'm kind of, for this evening, playing with this idea that all of us are being questioned, are going through self-questioning in looking at these works. One of the innumerable ways of engaging with Tagore's visual practices, please mark the words, one of the innumerable ways, is to engage oneself with whole of Tagore's creative and critical writings. Now, when I do this, I've given these talks in various cities of the world. Those who don't know Bangla and don't know Tagore as a genius of one who formed the entire language and literature of the whole culture, pan-Indian culture, I can get away with that because they're from Spain and Germany, they don't understand. They say paintings and literature. But when I take this decision to talk like this, it's very deliberate, and I'm involved in taking a risk because, let me put it simply, I'm reading Tagore's paintings, I'm not seeing them. But my act of reading, I like to suggest and stand by it, is actually a way of seeing Tagore's paintings. And in Tagore's case, it's inseparable because it so happens that he's equally involved in creative and critical practices that take you far beyond looking at someone as an artist. And I want to make that point also. There is another idea I'm playing with. The earlier title of my talk was The Poetics of Disembodied Self. They are very playful words, these are very high-sounding, disembodied self. This actually comes from a favorite writer of mine at a particular moment, Jack Kerouac, who created a whole school of disembodied poetics, which simply meant and suggested that, taking a clue from Freud, that let it go, man, just let it flow. The automatic writing and babbling and doodling and everything that you do, which generally goes in the name of nonsense, superfluous, useless, is what for Tagore constitutes the entire activity of being an artist. So the idea I'm throwing up is from Tagore, the idea of the surplus. The idea of that which is, what is surplus? Surplus is an idea which is about, after having settled all the accounts, after 5 rupiah maine liye, fir wapas de diye, hisab ho gaya, chukte, as we call it in Gujarati, settled. What is left after life is settled is what Tagore calls art, which actually is not a very different idea from coming from a German thinker Kant, who says that it's the disinterested interestedness. Entire Tagore's aesthetics, that is to say his creative and critical practices, because he's not a theoretician, he's a practitioner, it emerges from this very basic core idea of the surplus. And surplus is that which is superfluous. And superfluous is that which is, generally speaking, useless. Kuch kaam ka nahi hai. Aha, Tagore has got it. Jo kuch kaam ka nahi hai, wohi main kar raha hu, kala hai. This is how he looks at it. Of course, we like to project a whole lot of things in it, but actually it connects with Pandit Jagannath's classic idea of art as Leela, play. And this is what Tagore's work, I think, achieves beyond our comprehension. How on earth can this man, between 1924 and 1941, does 2,400 paintings and surprises himself and the world and changes the way we look at what is it to be an artist, what is the work of art, and who are we thinking about what is it to be an artist and what is the work of art. And the last point that I'm going to play around with is the idea of representation, because that preoccupies us, the representation, the crisis of representation. It so happens we are living in a time when none of us find it easy to understand what is quote-unquote real. Virtual reality having overtaken everything. We get slightly confused, but we get along with the business of life. I think Tagore has a deep understanding of the notion of what is real. He makes a classic distinction between facts and truth. All his life he makes this distinction. And if we get to the idea of truth, and suspend and get rid of once and for all from our mind the idea of facts, we are in the realm of Tagorean art practices. Having said this, none of this actually illuminates and analyzes specific ways by which one engages with Tagore's paintings. But that's precisely the point I want to make, that there is no art historian, there is no tradition of going from somewhere to Tagore's paintings which can illuminate what is going on. All that can illuminate Tagore's work is our personal commitment to enter into that poetics. So the very last point is about the question of poetics. When we are thinking about Tagore's work, in a manner of speaking about any work, we are entering into a dialogue about the poetics that is encountered, if at all. Because if that is not encountered, we just like tourists, we passing by. But when we encounter, go through that experience of being engaged, something is beginning to emerge, and I call that something the poetics. And by poetics, I simply mean, for the time being, the ways by which we make sense of our lives. That is to say, our style of presenting ourselves in the world. So when we engage with Tagore's paintings, we begin to go through the magical experience of changing the ways by which from now on we will present ourselves to the world. That is to say, the ways by which we will make sense of being born and dying. That is to say, we make sense of our impermanence. That is to say, our fragility and vulnerability. And that is to say, the shunya bodh, the dukha bodh. This is what Tagore is up to. Of course, all this in the context of superfluous and surplus, and therefore ananda bodh, therefore delightful. So here we are playing with this number of ideas. Of course, all this in the context of the ways by which I've experienced Tagore's paintings, and I hope that something similar begins to happen. It's a way of reading Tagore's paintings. So, we begin with Tagore. He's imaging the text. It's an amazing thing. Ustad Derrida would learn a thing or two from this. What is he doing? He's involved in the act of erasing. And when you erase something, the traces are left. And one of the most classic things you can do to erase is a text that you compose. That is Tagore's own manuscripts. It all begins there, somewhere there. He's looking at his manuscript and he wants to do something to it. He puts some scratches and then he begins to draw figures and things begin to happen. But actually he's involved in trying to come to understand the notion of a text. The word text is quite an amazing thing because it's a logos. Text means, language involved in making meanings, and meaning formation activities and obsession with human beings. And Tagore says, somewhere something is tricky about wanting to always form a meaning. Because I remember, we're talking about surplus and superfluous, no meanings. Don't seek out for profound significance in that little play which is going on. So how do you deal with that? So Tagore deals with it by saying, I will form an image from the text. So that's the beginning. Temporary idea, beginning. Imagine the text. But when you do that, every text becomes an image. That is to say, now you have the freedom to turn all that meaning-bearing burden of being human into meaning, less joy of being human. And that's opens up. That explains perhaps the extraordinary energy of 2,400 verse in the span of 12 years between the age of 64 and 81. And you say, God, I can do it too. Tagore's poetics is an invitation for all of us to take up the responsibility of being an artist. There is no other way. Either you respond. To respond to Tagore's paintings is to take up the responsibility to be fully involved in the poetics for oneself. That's the point I'm making. So now we go through. Years ago, this is written by a brilliant Bengali poet, Vishnu Dale, who writes on Tagore's paintings quite, very, very well. He says, years ago an art school principal told me, Vishnu Dev, that Tagore could not represent even a matchbox. Poor fellow, man. He wouldn't get admitted in any of the schools because he didn't even know how to draw, quote unquote, represent a matchbox. And how could he be termed a painter? I think this summarizes the crisis of representation most brilliantly. One of the persons that comes to my mind is Bhupen Khattar, who fought with this idea all his life because he was surrounded by those who were so well trained and so good in representing, Atul being one of that. And Bhupen would say, yes, I'm challenging the very notion of representation. So here we are. Let's move on. Now, of course, we are involved in a hopeless project, actually. We're talking about that which cannot be talked about. It should be only looked at. But an exercise that will begin to make us look at it in a manner which is worthwhile. So I've taken a quotation from Wittgenstein which says, whereof one cannot speak, one must be silent. So I have 90 minutes to be silent. Why? Because Tagore writes that I'm often asked about the meaning of my pictures. I remain silent even as my pictures are. It is for them to express and not to explain. The whole burden is taken away of explanation. And they have nothing ulterior behind their own appearance. Appearance is a way by which you show up. To appear, to show up. This is a term which is very brilliantly used in a lot of 20th century philosophy. Because what is it to appear as opposed to be? And this appearance for thoughts to explore and words to describe. Thoughts are not available. And words are inadequate. What do? You move on. Okay. Now I'm going to let this go. This is a lot of details about, my idea that Tagore is involved in what can be described as half-conscious self-knowledge. And what is half-conscious self-knowledge is always on the periphery of the known and the unknown. And therefore the conscious and the unconscious. So large number of Tagore's work has to do with playing with the subconscious. I like to suggest that. And that's I've taken up that because here what hurts, what gives pain. And I'm suggesting this on a big way. Tagore's largely his work is the work of poetics of absence. That which is shunya. And we will see that Tagore's paintings would reveal that one after the other. Many of his drawings, his masks, his faces are about that which is not there. And human beings cannot bear the idea that once which was there is not there anymore. Here we can go into a little autobiography, the biography of Tagore, which is to do with him having lost his most loved person on this earth, his sister-in-law who committed suicide. And he bears that pain and wound all his life. But this is one way of reaching out to what is hidden, the poetics of absence. And I've talked about that in great detail. Let's move on. So my idea of two frameworks is what I meant when I said the word Atma Vistar, which is again from Balaka poems of Tagore, where he talks about, you expand yourself so much that nothing is outside of it. The Walt Whitman's idea of I am the universe. But Atma Vistar is overflowing the self, and along with it erasing of the self. And we will see large number of Tagore's work has to do with the question of self. What is this self? And even when he's doing animals and reptiles, and even when he's involved in landscapes, and even when he's doing large number of human figures of all kinds, we begin to get a sense of something which is about the self. And Tagore reflects on it extensively in his writings, in his journals, in his poetry, in his prose writings, in his fiction. Everywhere this question comes up. Once you begin to notice that, you say, God, he's connecting it with the whole question of visual practices. And see him in the perspective of cultural and historical perspective, which is always a worthwhile activity to do, where he comes from, what are the ways and what are the manners by which he imbibed the contemporary practices of art which was being done in his family, outside in India, how he moves to Europe, sees works in various museums. Ocampo tells him about surrealism and about all that is going on. All that's of course relevant if one takes further entry into it. So we are not dehistoricizing Tagore. We are simply suggesting that all that history, all those historical and cultural perspectives, all those well-informed ways by which we look at works of art will not in any way take us in the close proximity of the work unless we are ready to put ourselves at the center of it. Tagore, to place them outside into the realm of transcendence, but to suggest that how history in case of someone like Tagore as an artist emerges as personal history. Tagore has some remarkable views on history also. He makes a clear distinction between, history as tathya and history as bhava. So tathya is the way things are, the way we read history, and bhava gata itihas. He says the history of an individual and community and nation and humankind in the cosmos should be felt and not defined. He's written an extensive number of essays on that. Let's move on. Let's move on. This is history, so for the time. Now, I'm starting with this very unusual work, I grew up enchanted by 20s as far as my obsessions, my concerns, my family life is concerned. It's with the Dadais and the Surrealists and the Futurists and the whole early 20th century. And the work of people like Jean Arp and many, many artists of that period was fascinating because they were achieving a kind of uncertainty about the image. And I thought this is one of the best ways to engage with visual world and its experiences. And Tagore achieves it in a manner which is remarkable. Of course you can see an animal there. It is in the context of his work of, animal image that he has. But look at the way it allows you to distort it. It allows you to break the perspectives. It allows you to break the ideas of composition. It allows you to break everything that you've inherited. This is one of the works whereby you are able to say that Tagore achieved the kind of abstraction that one longs for after many years of studied, improvisations with oneself. And he does it like that. Because of that, suspending the idea of carrying the burden of being quote-unquote trained. Okay. Now, of course, this is the entire aesthetics of Tagore, which I have arrived from various writings of Tagore. And if any of these, even if you read one of this, you will get an idea and a clue as to look at Tagore's paintings. He says, that is the world of pictures. We want to see because we love to see things. The act of seeing is an act of love. Otherwise we don't see. And the whole idea of bringing in love in the act of seeing, it is out of this ardor that visible objects come up in our world. Now this is amazing. He is saying that objects, stools, tables, trees, mountains, rivers, little things on our table, they don't exist otherwise. It's not an idealist point of view. He's simply saying that they come up because of this ardor, because of this longing, because of this desiring, something begins to emerge. So the entire Bhava Srishti and the visual Srishti of Tagore's painting practices emerges out of that act of longing, that act of desiring. And therefore what happens has nothing to do with representation. It's to do with that act of love and act of longing. And so he says they do not carry any philosophical ideas, they do not claim to resolve any problems of our everyday life, nor do they raise moral issues. They only convey to us the fact they exist. That the sheer being of the world is Tagore's primary concern. He says it in one of his most brilliant essays, which he wrote. It's a very playful essay. He calls it Vaichitya Nibandha, and the essay is called Pagal. Pagal. This is amazing. He talks about this idea of existing, absolute existence, the sheer being of everything. Now, if you take that idea seriously, which Tagore does, you begin to suspend the idea of that which is beautiful and that which is not. You begin to understand that the whole idea of beautiful and ugly, the whole idea of one against the other, is completely irrelevant to being an artist. And this is an amazing sense of freedom that you experience. You are freed once and for all. You, like Nietzsche would dream of, beyond good and evil. This whole idea of being good and evil has to do with the sheer acceptance of things as they are. And this is what he meant when he says that they only convey to us the fact they exist, absolutely exist. Consequently, they also sharpen in a particular way the feeling that we also exist. Now, this is amazing. Our experience of the work of art, of that which comes up and appears, actually is an experience of knowing, feeling, experiencing who we are. So at the center of all acts of seeing is the center of being the self that you are, which you take it there. And therefore you begin to form your own poetics in the experience of such encounters. Tagore is one, it could be Malarme, it could be Surdas, it could be Tulsidas, that's not the point. But you are invited to participate in that exercise. If you don't, you lost it. So he says, what is a picture is that it bears witness to this absolute concrete existence. Now, when we keep this in mind, just one of the formulations, Tagore has innumerable formulations. All his life he reflected on what is it to paint, what is it to write, what is it to compose, what is it to be an artist and define yourself in the world as one. Let's move on. Okay, let's move on. Now, okay, sorry. I'm starting with this because, you know, I've talked about face-to-face, I talked about being amne-samne and being invited to look into the eye, because the act of looking is also a kind of gaze that all of us develop. Is what John Berger calls the ways of seeing involves a particular way by which you situate yourself. As we all know, those who are used to visiting galleries and museums, or those who have been taught to do that, we all situate, position ourselves in front of a work of art. Now, here what is happening, the positioning is not in front of the world. It is face to face with one another. The other is the one is the other. This is Tagore's favorite idea, that all creative activities has to do with making the other yourself and yourself the other. A very, very simple idea basically, but how painfully difficult we find that idea. We always live in the not looking or subjugating or overpowering or destroying or distressing the other. Here, that question comes in a frightful way. When you look at it, you're beginning to get frightened with the possibility of looking into the eye. And this sense of being frightened is to be resolved through visual practices. And we will see that Tagore does that. He takes it up as a challenge, he stays with it, expresses it, and in the process, a sense of magic begins to happen. You come to terms with it. Now that it is abhivyakta, the vyakti is abhivyakta. The expression has formed the vyakti already. Okay, let's move on. Now, of course, it all began with what? Now I'm going to do a little sketch of how it all, those of you who probably know, but we can go through it one more time. So, I describe Tagore's paintings as happenings, they are happenings. Happenings have a certain sense of chance encounter, certain sense of accidental presence, certain sense of spontaneity, certain sense of just like that, by the way, Most of us don't take this very seriously, but for those who understood the surrealist aesthetics, accepted this, John Cage and Andre Breton, all of them have talked about the possibility of finding the extraordinary in the ordinary, a marvelous standing by the road, and just like that. Now, this idea of just like that is happening. Another way of describing these happenings is to notice the movement away from the notion of meaning and significance into the realm of freedom. Now, one talks like that, but one can't practice it because human life is a bondage. Tagore understood this very well. He was always wanting to free himself from this tyranny of meaning, the tyranny of being bound into a social framework defined as a Bhadralok, as a Brahmin's son who must perform, who must talk in a certain... We'll see a lot of his paintings as prove it. Not here, there, there, somewhere. What is this somewhere? This somewhere is the realm of freedom that Tagore and all of us, quote unquote, long for. The aparokshanubhuti, the unmediated vision of the self that we are. So he goes into the expansive play of the purposeless activity. Now, expansive play of the purpose, activity, the surplus, where in the ultimate analysis, the enveloping rasa is the rasa of Vismaya. Now, we look at the work on the right side. I mean, this is the manuscript doodles, and we'll see many of these. How it takes time, it's not as if he achieves it like that. It takes time because he doodles, then by, compulsive habits that we have all formed, we doodle into something significant, something noticeable, something recognizable, something that we can name, we can, describe, we can analyze. We can't but not do it. So large number of his doodles has to do with that, and slowly achieves an idea, slowly achieves that freedom which allows him to be free, where the text actually, not completely, believe me, it never gets completely erased, because every painting also, quote unquote, is a text anyway. So it never gets completely erased. What gets erased is the burden and the weight, what Italo Calvino calls removing weight from the world of objects is what artists do. They remove weight and things begin to float. You have Tarkovsky's film where an image begins to float, human beings take, it's the whole idea of that. And we'll see that when we look at many of his doodles, which is where he began. He has done around 500 works, which is just doodles, 500. And in the very beginning, as Shankho Chaudhary writes, most Indian artists of that period say, अरे वो तो एक कलकत्ता बंगाली लोग कमाल के हैं, डूडल्स को भी कला बोलते हैं. But when we see how it moves, move on. No, let's move on. This is also from, which we have already talked about, superfluous as where the art is born. Let's move on. Let's move on. This also is writing in 1930 as to how he is now completely seized by. Now, this is an amazing expression from Tagore. To be seized by. You are already 70-year-old, and you are seized by something. People would say, you need help, man, And we will see that he uses his word very, very carefully. He often uses the word salvation. He used the word as if कुछ पाप किए हैं. ये शब्दों ने अर्थ के आसपास घूमकर कुछ पाप किए. वो they are crying out, save me, save me. And he says, my attempt to bring out my manuscripts and turn them into an image is an act of saving. It's an act of grace. जैसे मैं कुछ अपने चमत्कार से इनको बचा लूंगा. We'll see that expression. Move on. Because the scattered scratches and corrections in his manuscripts. Now, many of us go through this experience of saying something and immediately adding, oh, no, I don't mean that, We are always about correcting ourselves and clarifying a little more and adding a footnote and always end up saying that, you know what I mean, and of course the other guy doesn't know what you mean. So the conversation must go on. Next day you must say, oh no, I didn't mean that, and sometimes it turns into India, Pakistan. That is to say, the hate begins to take over because the other seems to not understand what you mean. And Tagore is about that. The scattered scratches and correction in his own manuscript. He has composed them, he's written them, he's formed them. He's a poet for the last 60 years. He's been writing poetry from the age of 8. He's a master of all possible rhythms and meters that you can imagine. He can perform like that, and still he feels that that line needs correction. And that annoyed him. What is it that required correction? What is it that is a script that we are writing of ourselves that requires correction? That's what I think he's suggesting. And he started making the corrections dance, connecting them in a rhythmic relationship and transforming accumulation. What's a word? He transforms accumulation into adornment. Of course, adornment also must go. We will see that. Because adornment is alankar, and that's enriching. And Tagore will come to terms with Shunyabodh we are talking about. So even that must go. But that's going to take time. But to start with, it begins with accumulation being turned into adornment. And accumulation is burden, isn't it? Of course, we accumulate life insurance policies and share certificate cards and we accumulate so much, and Tagore is about that. We'll see that he ultimately is moving in the aesthetics of quote-unquote simplicity, where even adornment will go, will move. So these are on the right examples of what is meant by the scatter scratches and corrections that moves into doodles, and we can move on and see many of these. We can move on. Okay. Now here it says, Tagore points out that in the manuscript of creation, now he's no more talking about his own writings, the creation itself, that is to say the universe as given, there occur erring lines and erasers, solitary incongruities standing against the world principle of beauty and balance, carrying perpetual condemnation, and it was his impulse for rhythm and compulsion to seek harmony that led him to turn these corrections into visual images. Of course, this is how it all begins, I like to think. To put it very crudely, we like to beautify the world in which we are born. This is very crude, but this is how it is. You have a classic dialogue from Samuel Beckett's play Endgame, where you go to a tailor and give your coat for stitching, and he takes time, and he takes more time, and he takes more time, so you get very, very angry with it. And you say, God, the God made the world in 6 days, and you taking 6 months to make my, trousers. So the tailor tells the guy that, look at the world and look at my trouser. Now, why this story? Because we are all caught up in this idea of quote-unquote, the world that I'm creating is much better than the world in which I was born. So Tagore begins with that. He'll give up on this. But he begins with the idea of rhythm and harmony and beauty. Very likable ideas. Who doesn't like them? We like to see Tagore as, kitna sundar hai, kya roop hai, kya rang hai, kya srushti banai. No. Because then you are caught up in the meaning formation activity of carrying the whole burden of the aesthetic tradition of representing in one way or the other the world, if nothing else, through lines and rhythms and harmony. Even those concepts must ultimately go, and we'll see that they go. And that's the journey of Tagore as an artist. He doesn't stay with the idea of beauty and rhythm and lines and harmony, because they're such good, likable ways by which you correct erring mistakes in the script of the creation. So he does that. There is a way by which we can, feel comfortable with the nice things that are happening there. The nice things, like we tell a child, hey, acha lag raha, acha kar rahe ho. Tagore is telling himself, acha lag raha hai, But he begins there and he realizes that's not the game he is involved in playing as an artist. Something else must happen. So we'll see that. But he goes on, he does this, Look at the language of the way he describes. When the scratches in my manuscript cried like sinners for salvation, and assailed my eyes with the ugliness of their irrelevance. If any time we can all go through this experience of being suddenly struck at the uselessness of having spent 40 years doing linguistics, or being a managing director of Wember and Factor, or Phillips or whatever, and you say, God, what have I done with my life? Now, the ugliness of that irrelevance. Irrelevance of what? And ugliness of what? He is suddenly hit by the idea that his life as a poet, his life as a Bhadralok, his life as a creative genius that he was gifted beyond, our imagination. He was beginning to look at it carefully, questioning it, and wanting to understand where he stands as a human being in this world. Some of his later poems reveal this brilliantly. There's a poem where he says that, I always worshipped and loved the rivers and the mountains and the life of the beauty and rhythm and lines, but I had no courage to enter into the fellow man's little home and look at it. What is it that I'm missing? And the poem is, and that poem is a great narration of self-confession for being inadequate as a human being. And he writes this in 1940 at the age of 79. And one of the finest poems of declaring yourself to the world. So I often look more time in rescuing them into a merciful finality of rhythm. So he rescues them, so to say. So all these works are a rescue operation kind of thing that Tagore is doing with his own meaning formation activity. Let's move on. Yeah, and then I describe how schematic and metamorphic images along with rendering of human faces, bird or beast, all this begin to happen because all these are recognizable images, no, of the world that you have born into, the world that you are beginning to at least name, describe, analyze, evoke, whatever ways. It's still not the Shunya Bodh. It is still the Bodh with all kind of possibilities of existence. So the work you can see on the right from the manuscript is in English, one of these English poems. More. And now you can see more and more of the desire to, kind of represent, quote unquote. And we'll see he slowly frees himself from that more. The very last verse that we'll see in this series, go on. Yeah. Some often end up being illustrations, and one should take that into also account, Yeah, yes. Now, a point comes when the meaning formation activity is given a decent, usko jala diya, chhod diya. Now, imagine, we call various names for it, it's the stages of life, and, grahasthashram, and then vanaprastha, where you hand over the keys to your daughter-in-law, right?